in 1996. Commissioner Bratton gained an international reputation for re-engineering the police department, revitalizing morale in the largest and achieving the largest crime reduction in the city's history. As chief of the Los Angeles Police Department from 2002 until 2009, Commissioner Bratton brought crime to historically low levels through his real-time and predictive policing initiatives. He also transformed LAPD's relationship with the local communities during what was then a very turbulent time. The commissioners received numerous awards, including recognition as a Commander of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire. He currently serves as the executive chairman for the Teneo Risk Advising Corporation, advising corporations on tools they need to handle a constant evolution of threats. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Commissioner Bill Bratton as your presenter.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for allowing me to interrupt your lunch. I'm going to spend about 35 minutes with you, taking you on a walk through the last 50 years of my life in the profession that I love, policing. Policing is like the profession that so many of you spend your time in, many of you being law enforcement, many of you associated with law enforcement through your efforts to improve safety on our highways and roadways. Public safety and traffic safety are joined at the hip. We cannot function without each other. And as I prepared for the remarks today, I took a look at what you were spending your time doing these several days in terms of your history and matched it up against my history in my profession, the profession of policing. The similarities are amazing. I'm reminded in looking at those similarities of the opening line of the book, A Tale of Two Cities. Many of you probably read in high school or college. Those opening lines were, they were the best of times, they were the worst of times. As I look at where we are today with public safety and where you are with traffic safety, it's very applicable. So much of what's happening in your world today, the presentations you're receiving, the discussions you're having, it is the best of time. The technologies that are now coming into the forefront, the evolution over the last 50 years, that evolution that parallels so closely the evolution of my profession, policing. But it's also the worst of times. And the worst of times is echoed by some of the statistics that you've been listening to. Some of it's certainly influenced by the COVID epidemic that we are now thankfully coming out of, but also influenced by many other things that have been happening in recent years in our society. And in my remarks today, I'm going to take you on a walk through time, through my experiences, my eyes, to take us to where we are today, best of times, worst of times. What are the worst of times that you're discussing during this conference? The fact that after 25 years of steadily improving statistics in your world, that has changed. Certainly influenced by COVID, but influenced by a lot of other things that are going on in your world as it relates to the vehicles and the vehicles that are coming onto the highways and the people that are driving them. 42,000 deaths. So for the first time in 25 years, you're starting to see that problem increasing. In my profession, my world, we are seeing the same thing. After 25 years of steady crime decline, and I'll speak specifically for a moment to my city, New York City, after 25 years of steady decline in crime and disorder, starting in 2019 and now continuing, not only in New York, but in America, we have seen an explosion of crime and disorder, murders and shootings in particular, to the extent that the FBI reported that we had almost a 30% increase in murders during the COVID period. So not the best of times in my profession or in your world. As I think back over these last 50 years, and it's actually been 50 some odd years I've been in the profession of policing, if you count my military time. In 1970, I fulfilled a childhood dream and became a Boston police officer, one day after my 23rd birthday. I had just finished 3 years in the U.S. Army, 1 year in Vietnam as a military dog handler. The society, the world I was coming into as a young police officer in Boston was as tumultuous, and in many respects more tumultuous than the world that we find ourselves living in our country today, and the world that our country is part of today. In the 1970s, looking around this room, many of you weren't even born at that time as I began my police career. Let me take you back in time. I want to take you back where we were, where we are, and where I think we might be going. And I think you'll see some of the parallels to what you spend your time and effort on, trying to improve highway and traffic safety. One of my early experiences as a Boston police officer back in the early 70s was the new momentum in your world to start doing something about the growing problem of drunk driving, the increasing fatalities that we're experiencing. So even as a young officer in Boston, I would spend oftentimes nights on overtime in a federally funded program. I think the acronym for it was ASAP. And the intent of it was putting out pairs of Boston police officers on Friday and Saturday nights to get drunk drivers, to get them as they were coming out of the nightclubs, coming out of special events, because there had been such a significant increase as we were starting to document highway fatalities. So my experience with your world actually, as I referenced, parallels very closely the experience in my world of growth in policing. The world of policing I entered in 1970s was one of extraordinary change. Coming out of the 1960s into the early 70s, America was going through an extraordinary period of change that was creating a lot of concern about where was our country going. We'd come out of the civil rights era. We had come out of the assassination of a president. We'd come out of the assassination of the Martin Luther King, the civil rights leader. We'd come out of the assassination of a would-be presidential candidate, Robert Kennedy, the attempted assassination of another candidate, George Wallace. We were in the midst of the anti-war demonstrations, a war that was ultimately going to take 50,000 young lives, a war I had participated in for 1 year and was so grateful to have come back, not injured and with my life. We were a country also going through societal change in terms of the sexual revolution. We were starting to increase our experimentation with drugs, and we were unfortunately also starting to experience growing crime and disorder on our streets. As a young police officer, the profession of policing was being challenged to meet all of these concerns, and we're not doing a very good job of it. The federal government and legislatures throughout the country opted to try to change the profession of policing, to make it a better educated, better trained, better equipped profession. But one of the things they changed in the 1970s that still 50 years later is impacting us negatively was that they changed the mission. The mission of policing since its founding in 1829, and I use 1829 as a date of the founding of democratic policing, as my own personal hero is Sir Robert Peel, the Prime Minister, but who was also the Home Secretary in Britain that created the Metropolitan Police, the British Bobby, named after Bobby Peel. Coppers, named after the copper buttons they wore in their blue uniforms. Why blue uniforms? Because up until that period of time, 1829, to deal with civil disorder, they used the army, the redcoats. So they wanted to basically have a totally different image on the streets of London. He had put out 9 principles of policing that have been my foundation and Bible ever since I was first exposed to them in 1975 as a young sergeant in Boston. The first of those 9 principles is the basic mission for which the police exist is to prevent crime and disorder. Those 5 words, to prevent crime and disorder. Well, in the 1970s, government changed that mission because it was believed that crime and disorder, that the police could not effectively prevent it. The best we could do was to improve our response to it. And I'll speak about that response in a moment. But that, unfortunately, for the next 30 years in particular, but now continuing for 50 years, as many police departments have still moved away from the idea they can prevent crime. We can, and we've shown that we can. But back in the 1970s, it was believed that the causes of crime were poverty, racism, the economy, unemployment, that those were causes that the Great Society was going to deal with. So much of the turmoil around civil rights, so much of the turmoil around the college kids protesting against the war, were around this idea that these were causing crime and disorder in our cities. I early on in my career learned that they were not causes, they were influences. What causes crime? What causes the world that you're trying to deal with? So much of what causes the world you're trying to deal with, highway fatalities and injuries, people. In my world, criminals, people who intentionally commit crime and disorder, sometimes in response to emotions. In your world, who commits basically the offenses that you're trying to reduce through technology, better safeguards, by and large, people and their behavior. And you learned, as I learned in my profession over my career, that you can prevent that behavior, that you can effectively influence it, but yet you can also prevent it. So going into the 1970s, American policing took a dramatic turn. And while some of it was beneficial, improved technology, et cetera, so much of it was negative. And I'll talk about three elements of what happened in the 1970s. And then I'm going to move you forward to where we are today in 2022. There's an old expression, Yogi Berra from the New York Yankees, deja vu all over again. Well, where we are in 2022, in my world, policing, is in many respects where we were in 1970. The idea that so much of what is happening in our society today mirrors what I was exposed to as a young cop, sergeant, lieutenant in Boston, then eventually chief of police in several departments, police commissioner in Boston, police commissioner particularly in New York City in the 1990s, LAPD police chief in the 21st century as we dealt with all the issues in our century. And then more recently, my second time as police commissioner in New York, 2014 to 2016. What were those three influences back in 1970s? I came into policing and was out in the street, well, 150 pounds of me back then, about 40 some odd pounds ago. And skinny Billy Bratton, after 8 weeks, was wearing the uniform of a Boston police officer with my badge that said patrolman. First woman did not come out of the Boston Police Department until 1976. We didn't change the badge to police officer to 1988. And there's an example of some of the frustrations and problems that we had in the 70s. No women. In my class of 155 officers, there were 3 minorities in the city that was already then 25% minority. Many, like myself, returning military veterans. But after 8 weeks, we were on the streets with my 6-shot Smith & Wesson revolver, 4-inch barrel, 6 spare rounds and loops on my belt, set of handcuffs, that badge, 12-inch club, the ticket book, and that was pretty much it. Oh, my call box key and a pocket full of dimes. Call box key was because we didn't have radios. We had to go to the call box on corners every 3 or 4 blocks. There was a light on the top of that call box if they wanted you for an assignment. The admonition as you left the roll call was, watch the lights, boys, watch the lights. So if that red light was on, you went to that call box with your call box key, you opened it. This was a cast iron box with this very heavy door. And the phone inside was from the 1920s. Little earpiece, little mouthpiece. And as you leaned in to get your assignment, you hope like hell that somebody's not going to come along and slam that door on your head. Another problem back in that era was alcoholism, something that you've been wrestling with in your profession, certainly the last 50 years. A lot of cops drank. And oftentimes in that call box was a little pint of alcohol where they basically went and sneaked that drink. But I reference that because that was the state in some respects of the technology that I experienced. When you think of what I've just described as the uniform, as a 23-year-old that I felt comfortable going into the streets to police the streets of Boston without a radio, pocket full of dimes to go to a payphone back when a call was a dime, or the call box key, and my 6-shot revolver. You look at the average police officer in America today and what they are wearing and carrying. The bulletproof vest, the semi-automatic weapon, at least 50 rounds of ammunition. They're carrying all types of trauma kits, thing is to deal with drug overdose. They have $5,000 radios, the bulletproof vest we talked about, the body cameras, all felt to be essentially necessary to police safely America's streets today. And that has been part of our transition over these last 50 years. Think of your world over these last 50 years. What was a vehicle like back in the 1970s? No seatbelts, no headrests, custom designed to also prevent shock, no safety windows in the car. The glass would shatter in the car in an auto accident. The state of the art back in those days was not basically to improve safety for the people in those vehicles. Look at how far you have come, the presentations, the one this morning, in terms of the automated vehicles that we're dealing with. The best of times that the technology is improving, the best of times in policing, that the technology, the training, now the average officer gets at least 6 months of training, not 8 weeks. The equipment that they have to deal with the extraordinarily complex jobs that they have today, the parallels between what you're working on and what policing is working on to deal with public safety and to deal with traffic safety. But during the 1970s, that 3 things were going on that have impacted us to this day, the 3 Ds. My wife is the legal analyst for CBS News, Vicki Kleeman, former criminal defense attorney. She says to always keep things in 3s because jurors would nod off after the 3rd. So you keep it to 3. So the 3 letters are for the 1970s. In what was described as the beginning of the professional era of policing, we're going to professionalize and modernize our policing. Better training, better equipment, better forensics. And the 3 Ds were what government and society was creating in that era to deal with what they thought were ways to prevent crime. Decriminalization. Many of the laws that police had used to control behavior in the streets, idle and disorderly behavior, public drunkenness, were taken away, oftentimes because we were abusing them. The 3rd degree, racial profiling, brutality were not unusual in American policing in that era. So some of this was intended to correct that behavior. But decriminalization took away many of the powers and the authority of police back then. And we are now seeing over 50 years a continuing erosion of the powers that we give our police officers to enforce the laws, the incredibly complex laws that we now have in our streets. We also had depolicing, in that most police departments in America in the 1970s, including mine, suffered dramatic cuts in the size and the funding of the departments, even as they were trying to improve their training in technology. Boston Police Department, I joined in 1970, there were 2,800 of us. By 1980, there were 1,544. Why do I know that number so well? Because I had to lay off almost 300 Boston police officers because in 1980, I was the superintendent in chief of the Boston Police Department. And in response to a fiscal crisis, we had to defund the Boston Police Department. Sound familiar? Defund. We closed the police academy. We got rid of the harbor patrol, the mounted unit, closed half of our police stations. 30 years later, Boston is still trying to deal with that defunding effort. But Boston was not unique. New York City, in the midst of one of the worst crime crises in its history, laid off 5,000 police officers in the 1970s. So we're dealing with decriminalization, fewer laws that the police could use to control behavior, criminal behavior, disorderly behavior in the streets, fewer police officers. Walking officers all but disappeared from most American streets. I started my first assignment as a walking officer, a white officer working in an all-black neighborhood that 2 years before had been all Jewish, but with redlining that basically they had created white flight. And I felt very comfortable in what unfortunately was becoming a high crime neighborhood with that 6-shot revolver, my whistle, et cetera, because the level of crime was nowhere near what it was going to become with this steady erosion of our ability to police in terms of effective numbers and effective strategy. What we did with technology is we put us in cars. Great, didn't have to walk anymore. And the car had a radio, so we could actually get messages, send messages. And then when they gave us air conditioning in 1978, even better, roll up the windows. But what did that do? It took us away from the community. It took us away from them interacting with us and us interacting with them. But we also created 911. Wonderful. pick up the phone, call police, get put to right away. But within a very short period of time, 911, it's like the alligator that ate American policing. We couldn't keep up with the calls. Police department after police department in America no longer had, because of the reduction of police, the new styles of policing, the ability to respond to public expectation. So we began to lose public support, the idea being that their feeling of safety was eroding. And the third thing that occurred of major impact was deinstitutionalization. In a well-intended effort to effectively deal with the horrific conditions in our mental hospitals that were worse than most of our prisons, we were going to return these poor souls to local neighborhood treatment centers, to home care, supervised home care. Wonderful, sounded great, but it just did not happen. Why? The money never came through. So what did we end up creating? You're familiar with the term homeless? Look at that term before the 1970s. You find a hard time finding it in terms of giving it to a class of people. We effectively created on our streets tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of poor souls who were coming out from mental institutions, many of them. Add to that the many returning veterans, unfortunately, coming back with what we now commonly understand as post-traumatic stress disorder and drug habits, and issues coming back into a society that was rejecting them in many instances, the anti-war movement. We had an incredible turbulence in the 1970s that in some respects, deja vu all over again. Deinstitutionalization. We are now trying to deinstitutionalize our prisons. We're letting tens of thousands of people out of jail, some of it under the auspices of COVID, but increasingly we're trying to keep people out of jail, well-intended. But I'm sorry, there's a lot of people that need to be in jail because they're bad people. They are criminals. And when they're out in the street, they're hurting you and I. So we have a great debate underway at the moment as we attempt to wrestle with, can we do criminal justice in a better way? But at the moment, we're losing ground in a tremendous way with the rising homicide, shooting, disorder I'm talking about. We also talked about that decriminalization. We are continuing to decriminalize and take away powers of police. New York City, my city, for example, that most of the laws that have been passed the last 3 years by our legislature and our city council have been to the benefit of the criminal. Bail laws in which basically you cannot set bail for people committing horrific offenses. Just yesterday, day before, in a McDonald's in the middle of Manhattan, the individual with a hatchet began attacking other customers he was fighting with, destroying property. Just find out this morning, he was released without bail because under the laws of New York State that have been changed the last couple of years, judges had no power to hold him on bail. He's back out in the street. The only good news is I don't think we had to return the hatchet to him. But in the 70s, deinstitutionalization, depolicing, and decriminalization. Think of where we are in 2022. The defund the police movement that decimated so many police departments. Decriminalization efforts that are continuing where we're trying to still push people out of jail instead of putting appropriate people in jail. And at the same time, wrestling with criminal justice reform that's needed. It is desperately needed. But sometimes it's a bridge too far going the other direction. And we also have, once again, the inability to deal with our homeless population on our streets, so many of whom are the poor souls that need to be in some form of mental facility to deal with their issues. And I speak from the experience of somebody living in New York. So as we go into the 1970s, all of this churning did what? Created more crime, more disorder, fewer police on the streets, and the so-called broken windows theory that I'm so well known for, that if you don't take care of the weeds in your garden, eventually they'll destroy the strongest oak tree. Well, if you don't take care of the victimless crimes, as they were called, graffiti, prostitution, gangs hanging on the corner, open drinking of alcohol on the streets, all those disorderly things that they effectively may not be serious crime, but what do they create? They create fear. They create fear that destroys neighborhoods. They create fear that causes people to flee those neighborhoods. And that's what happened in the 70s, that we basically drove out a large part of many populations of the city because they were fearful. They were fearful of the rising crime, but most people were not the victims of the serious crime. but they were victims of what they were seeing every day that were not being addressed. There were not enough cops there to deal with all that disorder. Then in the 80s, we compounded it with the idea of increasing weapons. My 6-shot revolver, throughout most of the 80s, I was outgunned by the growing population of guns in the hands of criminals, including semi-automatics and increasingly long rifles like the AR-15 that we're so concerned with today. To the extent that in 1990, as chief of the transit police in New York City, I had to fight like hell against the mayor, the police commissioner, the New York Times, to get my police officers 9mm semi-automatic locks, because they were being outgunned on the subways of New York by the criminal element. And that outgunning also basically was proliferating because of the other problem that we are wrestling with today that was beginning to emerge in the 70s, and that's drugs. The growth of initially the hallucinogens, a lot of our veterans brought back from Vietnam, marijuana, et cetera. But then into the 80s, we have cocaine, powder cocaine initially, then crack cocaine. And now we're dealing with, in the 2022, the new drug crises. Everything old is new again. We're losing over 100,000 lives a year to the opioid epidemic, the fentanyl epidemic. And in my world of keeping track of murders, we are experiencing a phenomenal growth once again in murders and shootings. So the 80s began to influence what began the worst crime year in the history of our country, 1990. New York City, 2,245 murders, 5,000 people shot in the streets, over 600,000 Part 1 crimes, murders, rapes, robberies, 110,000 stolen cars. And a lot of those stolen cars involved in crime, involved in injury, accidents that you're trying to prevent. But the good news was in the 1990s, myself and a number of other police chiefs who had learned in the 70s and 80s of the era of focusing on response to crime as a priority, that we returned to focusing on the prevention of it. Exactly what you focus on. You focus on responding to learn, but you focus on prevention so that you can effectively deal more effectively with your issue. Well, that's what we learned in the 90s in American policing. The idea that we could prevent crime using systems like I developed in New York City, CompStat, the system of the idea of measuring where crime was occurring so we could spot it after 3 or 4 that there was a growing crime trend, put cops on the dots. The idea that there was a way to control crime. It also resulted in the need for more police. And what did we do in the 90s? New York City hired 6,000 more or less police commissioner. America hired 100,000 more in 1994 with the crime bill that was put through back in 1994. And America experienced in the 1990s with its focus on prevention and the lessons learned from the 60s, 70s, 80s. Overall crime in America, violent crime went down by 40%. In New York City, it began a 25-year decline. So that by 2018, after I finished my second term as New York City Police Commissioner, homicides in New York City were down by 90%, fewer than 300 versus 2,243. Shootings were under 1,000, about 800 versus 5,000. Overall crime was down by 80% in the city. Those 110,000 stolen cars, about 10,000. So cops were able to basically, with the new technologies, but with a different goal, prevention. And so I celebrate your focus on prevention because the parallels between our two worlds, the key is prevention. And what are we seeking to prevent? Bad behavior, whether it's drunk driving, inappropriate driving, all the things that contribute to the growing deaths and injuries on our highway, despite all the increasing technology to make those vehicles safer. That my latest car, that with all the beeping and buzzing goes on, drives me crazy in the sense of, for all of you that can't even figure out half of what it's beeping about, but it's all intended to effectively draw your attention to the fact that you're erratic on the lane change, or the new one in my car is basically tells you to pull over, that you're starting to fall asleep. That it's just amazing how the technology has improved in your world and in my world. And that's so necessary because in the 21st century, the threats have changed dramatically in American policing. After 9/11, we had to focus on terrorism for the first time. Used to be the government's problem, the FBI, CIA. Now it was our problem. So I went back to LA in 2002 as chief of police, and that was the inspiration to come back into policing. In 1996, I left policing a little earlier than I anticipated. That I was working for Mayor Giuliani in New York. I was his first police commissioner. The two of us were sharing the success of, for the first time, crime going down dramatically by 40% in New York City in 2 years. But made the mistake of not staying in the headlights of the guy I was working for. So effectively, to use a car metaphor, I basically went over the Jersey barrier, flipped my car over half a dozen times, and was hanging by my seatbelt after I hit the ditch in terms of the contretemps between myself and the mayor. When police chiefs and mayors have problems, mayors always win. So I made damn sure that the next 3 mayors I worked for, I stayed in their headlights, and it was very beneficial to them and to me. But in the 21st century, as we're going forward, that going back to my opening comment, the best of times, the worst of times. Best of times because the technologies that are out there available to police to assist in the growing litany of things they have to deal with, cyber crimes, ransomware, drones, that all the new technologies that come with this wonderful digital world we live in, identity theft, that those complexities have made policing more professional, certainly, more technologically proficient, but the growth of the problem, having a hard time keeping up with it. Similarly, in your world, the growth of the issue, even as you have improved technologies, design of these cars, highway safety situations, still wrestling with the issue of behavior. So conferences such as this are so important to come and share ideas with the idea that in my profession, policing, it is all about the idea of trying to find ways to deal with behavior and to deal with it in a way that it doesn't incite racial tension, doesn't incite class tension, doesn't incite political tension. Similarly, in your world, you had a presentation last year by Carmen Best at this conference about dealing with the issues of concern around what we call in policing, bias policing, this idea that so much of what we do may have a negative impact on our minority communities, Native communities, and the wrestling with how do we effectively address those issues positively, while at the same time trying to address other issues that are growing at the same time. The challenges are immense. The crises we are in, and we are in a crisis as evidenced by the statistics this morning, and I'd like to share just fleshing out some of those statistics, and this is some of the material that was prepared for me in anticipation of this conference. Those 41 or 42,000 deaths, the presentation I saw this morning, I think it was 42,000. Fatalities in multi-vehicle crashes up 16%. Fatalities on urban roads up 16%. Fatalities among drivers 65 and older up 14%. Pedestrian fatalities up 13%. Fatalities and crashes involving at least one large truck up 13%. Daytime fatalities up 11%. Motorcyclist fatalities up 9%. Bicyclist fatalities up 5%. Fatalities and speeding related crashes up 5%. Fatalities and police reported alcohol involvement crashes up 5%. Everywhere you look, there's something to work on. The good news is you were trying to do it in what I believe is the appropriate way, through collaboration. You are here to learn from each other, to share ideas with each other. But the collaboration to be successful in traffic and road safety has to also be with the police in public safety. And there's several trends underway at the moment that are problematic in that regard, because you cannot do it without the police. You need police enforcement for seatbelt enforcement, for phones and hand enforcement, for all the various things that police do when they're out in those highways and byways. But increasingly, unfortunately, because of some of the issues we've been facing over the last several years, is increasing, taking away, decriminalization, if you will, the ability of the police to, if you will, interfere with inappropriate behavior. For example, several cities and states have already taken away the idea of police being able to do pretext stops. Pretext is the idea that oftentimes officers will stop a vehicle for broken tail light, no light on the license plate, no seatbelt. But the concern has been that their behavior is inappropriate, in that studies have shown that increasingly it has been believed that a lot of that is influenced by racial discrimination, racial profiling on the part of the police. Going forward, this is where the technology will hopefully be helpful. The education and training will be helpful, with the idea of trying to effectively find common ground where we can address the issues of concern around issues of race, but also address issues around concern about how do we enforce our laws without having a negative impact on issues of race. And that's the challenge of the 21st century, the challenge of the 2020s in your world and in the world that I spent so much of my time in. The good news is I think we're up for it. Why? Because we want to change. We're not resisting to it. There's an old expression about cops. There's two things they hate: change and the need to change. They gripe about it, but then when it happens, they gripe about it. That's my world. Well, certainly, I think there are so many issues out there that need to be changed, but we need to approach it from the perspective that working together, we can effectively make those changes positive. We were in tough times. But I grew up in the 1970s that were extraordinarily difficult times. By the 1990s, we had effectively worked our way out of it. And for 25 years, we were doing pretty well. Then it fell apart for a lot of reasons that we now need to understand as we go forward, trying to, in the 2020s, learn from what happened in the 2018, 19, 2020. We can do that. We did it once before. That the idea is to effectively collaborate, to constantly keep on learning, to constantly keep on striving, and to use all these technologies that are available to us. We are in interesting times. We're in tough times. And at the same time, I have an expression that has basically been my foundation going forward all my life. Out of crises comes opportunity. And if you don't have one, create one. Why? Because you can accelerate the change. And out of the crime crises of the 70s and 80s, in the 90s, I was able to use that crime crises and many of my colleagues to such an extent that we brought about profound change. You can deal with the new crises that you're facing, increasing traffic deaths, too effectively, but bring about profound changes going forward. And I applaud and I celebrate that effort. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you this afternoon. I think we have a little conversation we're going to have before I get off the stage and lose my voice. But thank you for your patience and your attention. And we have an expression in policing. Thank you for your service. Many of you are law enforcement or former law enforcement. So I'll close my remarks with that acknowledgement. Thank you for your service. It is so important. It is so critical in terms of the stability of America with all the crises we're facing. This is one where every family in America is impacted by what you are doing. And anything you can do to improve their safety is for the benefit of our country. So thank you. Gungadin.
Well, Commissioner, thank you so very much. I mean, there are just so many different places I could go following that presentation, and everything that I've learned after reading your book and in the conversations that we've had leading up to today. And again, just would like to express our gratitude for your presence here today and for your willingness to share what you've experienced in your 50+ year career of public service. So I'd like to throw that one back at you. Thank you for your service as well, sir. I've got a couple of questions or to start off the conversation. And you mentioned Sir Robert Peel, the father, the founder, the foundation of modern policing. And, you know, of the 9 principles, you know, there's a couple of them that stand out in my mind. I'm probably going to butcher them, so please feel free to correct me. The police are the people, and the people are the police. And the police can only be effective when they are accepted by the people. And those are really key foundational principles, I think, as we look at some of the challenges we're facing today. And over the course of your career, starting in Boston, going to New York Transit, NYPD, and then LAPD, and then back to NYPD, one of the key themes that I saw time and time again was the importance of your community engagement. Can you talk a little bit about how community engagement enabled you to do some of the things that you were able to do?
Sure. Thank you for that question. I talked about the 1970s and my first exposure to Sir Robert Peel, his 9 principles, and the comment about police are the people are the police. We don't fly police officers in from Mars. They come from our communities. Not an American police chief today who did not start as a police officer, work their way up. We just don't bring them in from the outside, like doctors, basically. Doctors have to work their way up. In the 1970s, I was very fortunate that I was promoted fairly quickly, studied like crazy, and was put in charge of a neighborhood policing program that was supported by 21 leading institutions in the Boston Fenway Park area where the Red Sox are located. Boston University, Northeastern University, Museum of Fine Arts, institutions that were the heart and soul of the culture of Boston. But the areas had deteriorated so much with crime and disorder, street prostitution, graffiti, patrons no longer coming. Parents were afraid to send their kids to BU, to Northeastern. And so they approached the Boston Police Department about, can you try to do something to change this? I was working out of the police commissioner's office at the time, and I was assigned to develop a neighborhood policing program. And I was a whiz kid. I knew how to use the computers back in those days when they were 3 feet long green sheets of paper. And I was pretty good at it. I still can't figure out my smartphone, but back in the day, I could figure those things out. And I went into those neighborhoods loaded for bear. I had all my crime stats and for Boston, the first neighborhood meetings. I put up posters that neighborhood meeting tonight in this church or this school hall, please come. And I'd come and I'd bring the couple of cops that were assigned to that area to listen to the community. But back in those days was more to talk to them, to tell them what we were doing to deal with what we, the police, believe were the problems. And after a couple of meetings, I had a young female assistant that was working with me. The schools had funded that we were doing a matrix of what were the questions. And at the end of the night, meeting after meeting in some of the worst crime areas in Boston at that time, what were people talking about? Not those murders and rapes and robberies that I had all these stats for. They wanted to talk about that prostitute who was working in their hallway. They wanted to talk about those kids in the corner peeking up at night, the abandoned cars that were never towed by the city. They were talking about the quality of life, so-called victimless crimes that we, the police, were not paying attention to. Why? As the politicians had told us to focus on responding to serious crime more effectively and measure our success by the number of arrests we were making, the number of clearances, after the fact policing. And I came to understand very early on in the developmental phase of my career that the politicians had it wrong in the 70s. So Robert Peel had it right, that the basic reason the police exist is to prevent crime, to work with the community. And that's what he talks about, that the police are the people and the people are the police. And that the idea of the measurement of the success of police is not by our activities making arrests, but the absence of our visibility making those arrests. Why? Nothing to arrest for, because we have made the neighborhood safe. A long-winded answer to that question, but it's the heart and soul of how we began to turn crime around in America, listening to the communities in terms of what was making them feel unsafe. Isn't that what you do? You listen to the public in terms of what is it that's making them unsafe that they want you or the manufacturers or all the various vendors here to do to make their driving experience safer. And that's the reality, to listen.
Very good. Thank you. That's just so, makes so much sense, the way that you describe that and how important that becomes. You know, kind of building on that discussion, you are one of the pioneers when it comes to leveraging data to solve problems. And so can you tell us a little bit about how your data management projects, you know, certainly CompStat is one of those, but how you were able to use that in conjunction with that community outreach in order to build legitimacy within the communities that you work with?
He's used the word CompStat. Some of you law enforcement certainly familiar with it. It's revolutionary idea that was created in New York during my time as commissioner with a number of brilliant people I had the opportunity to work with. And it revolutionized American policing in the sense that we accumulated huge amounts of data, but we weren't doing anything with it. One of the things that I started doing in those neighborhood meetings was putting maps up in my office with plastic acetate and then tracking not only the serious crime with yellow or red dots, but also some of those complaints we were receiving. So very quickly, we were able to identify hotspots where there was a community concern about serious crime or there's community concern about quality of life. And out of that evolved this concept called CompStat, short for computer statistics. Back in the 90s, if you wanted to label a program in a computer, it could only have 8 letters. So computer statistics became CompStat. And effectively, what did it do? It has 4 elements to it. And as I recite these 4 elements, think of you in terms of yourself dealing with your doctor. Timely, accurate intelligence. In other words, I want those police reports coming in every day documented. I want them going up on the map. Back in those days, it was little push pins on a map. Now we do it by computer. Back in those days, I'd have a clerk do them every night. Now I can record them on the cops with their smartphones as they're coming in. Timely, accurate intelligence. Rapid response that effectively, I have an emerging problem. Let me put police resources into that area. Uniform, task force, plainclothes. What will it take to very quickly deal with that emerging problem? Effective tactics. What is effectively working to diminish that problem? And then after we clear it up, relentless follow-up, because we know it's apt to come back again. CompStat, those 4 elements. Think of yourself from a medical perspective in the sense of you're not feeling well, you go to the doctor, does an examination, timely, accurate intelligence. Finds something on your skin that he wants to check out, sends it out, sure enough, comes back, it's cancerous. Rapid response. He's going to want to use effective tactics. Be able to basically just freeze it, going to have to scrape it, going to have to be an operation. But then even after he thinks he's removed the cancer problem, he wants to see you every 6 months to make sure it's not coming back. So what we began to do in American policing in the 90s was effectively what medicine had been attempting to do throughout its history, effectively deal with the individual patient. The beauty of CompStat, it allows you to deal with individual neighborhoods, like individual patients, individual cities. Because I've worked in enough cities that no 2 cities are alike. We compare them all the time, but they're not. Louisville is so different than New York City or Los Angeles, believe me. And it's not just because of the bourbon here. There's basically they're very different cities in so many respects. They have some commonality. And a doctor, when he examines you, is looking for some of the commonalities that he knows he has medicines that he can treat. So American policing made a phenomenal discovery, if you will. Let's use data, which we gather, but let's use it in a very different way. It was revolutionary, and it's one of those V8 moments. Why didn't I think of that back in the 70s? Well, I did, but it took 20 years to basically take it to New York City, where New York City is, if you make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. Well, since we got crime down so dramatically in New York, people took notice. In Boston in the 70s, weren't noticing. Effectively how it came about. You mentioned, if I may, for a moment, that the book, one of the reasons I was asked to speak at this event was some of the exposure they had to my most recent book, which is The Profession. My first book was in '96 after my falling out with Giuliani. It was a biography, Turnaround. It was about how did we turn around crime, CompStat, and understanding that you could prevent crime. Second book was in 2013 after I had left the LAPD. Thought once again my police career was over, and that was a book called Collaborate or Perish. You heard me use that term several times here. It was about 24 case studies working with a co-author who did case studies at Harvard about successes and failures, but the essential element of the success was always collaboration. Essential element in a failure was always lack of collaboration. So I am celebrating you being here collaborating. Third book, a memoir. A memoir is very different than a biography. Biography was my story up to '96 when I thought I was leaving policing for good. Little did I know I had only got half a career. I still had LA and New York again ahead of me. The memoir is effectively the history of policing through my experiences, but as importantly through the experiences of many of the people I had the opportunity to interact with. Great cops, great community activists, great people, great politicians, good and bad. And so the book is intended to be, in some respects, I commented earlier about deja vu all over again. The idea that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past, that we need to understand our history. First page in the book is a quote from one of my former colleagues, the late John Timoney, brilliant police officer. And the quote, I'll paraphrase, is, those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. Those who know police know we don't know our history. That's the reality. In my profession, ashamed to admit it, many of my colleagues don't know their history, a lot of which I've shared with you during this last hour. And you need to know it so you don't repeat it and stumble all over it again. That's effectively some of what's going on now, understanding the need that we don't, to improve the issue around race. We can't keep making the mistakes that we made in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. We need to approach it in a different way. There are ways to approach it where you can have fair policing, safe and fair everywhere for everyone, whether they're black or white or brown. And that's the lessons to be learned. And so that was the purpose of the book. The idea being that we need to understand our history. That's what you attempt to do here. What was working that for 25 years you got traffic fatalities down, and what changed apart from COVID? COVID's a big influence, certainly. But a lot of it has to do, I think, with, we were talking about this earlier, look at the advertising of the auto industry at the moment on television. They're advertising these souped up cars that there's one that's basically something that's driving police crazy in America right now, the drag racing coming back again, and then the donut things that are going on. This commercial is basically selling cars, showing off doing donuts. At the same time, we have increasing showing off the ability to speed, the ability to high performance, rather than talking about the safety. Anyone talking about safety is Volvo is based, I can see, that known for its safety. Remember when smoking was something that we're very concerned with, and effectively television, movies stopped showing people smoking? Worked for a while. Look at the studies in terms of people stopping smoking. It's back again big time. So you have influence with that auto industry and their advertising. Advertising that in this day and age should be advertising the safety of their vehicles for people and their families, instead of advertising for their 18-year-old kid to go out there and try to do a 100-mile-an-hour donut in the middle of an urban street and end up killing himself. So it's effectively where collaboration that you're known for as an organization can have impact. Something that police learned finally in the 70s and 80s, we needed to collaborate with our communities. We thought we had all the answers, certainly didn't. And in many of our communities, what we thought was appropriate policing, they believed, and rightfully so in many instances, was oppression, was racially inappropriate policing. We need to learn from those lessons of the past going forward.
Thank you. Pam, I'm going to time check. How much have we got?
5-2.
5 to 3. Okay. We've got like 5 minutes, folks, and I'm sorry I didn't mean to monopolize everything here, but I'd like to open it up for any questions from our audience today. I think the commissioner has been a great guest, so I'm sure that there's probably some really good questions out there. So I think we have a couple of microphones because we are webcasting this. Make sure that if you have a question, please speak into one of the microphones. Raise your hand if you have a question. Great.
Can't hear you, but I can see you.
Hang on, there we go, sir. Thank you.
Mic.
Hello, Doug Schinkel with the National Conference of State Legislatures. I'm curious, I know that in New York City, they now have 750 speed cameras in school zone areas, and given all the issues with recruiting officers and what have you. And I guess I'm just curious on your thoughts on something like automated enforcement. Clearly, it's a way to kind of extend the reach of policing and cut down on dangerous driving behavior. But you could say there's some negatives to it in terms of perception and decoupling a human presence and what have you. And I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are on kind of automated speed and red light enforcement. Thank you.
On that particular issue, I'm very supportive of the speed camera issue in terms of its expansion. New York City, in its wisdom, and actually the wisdom of Albany, which controls so much of the legislation in the city of New York, like actually when back in the revolutionary times when England was trying to control what was happening in the colonies, we're still living in that era in New York City with Albany still trying to control everything. They dictated that basically speed cameras could only be activated during school hours. And recently now they've enacted legislation and showing clearly the extent of speed violations in those school areas. So New York has recently lowered its speed limit to 25 miles an hour from what had been 30 for years. I think the state is intending to do it in literally every city and town, absent the city or town deciding it wants it higher. I'm in favor of the technology that Waze, for example, is a technology. I wonder how the hell I ever lived without it. When I was in LA, I had this gigantic book that every LA cop had with them to try and find their way through the hills up there now with Waze. But it's been criticized, the idea that, well, it gives you warnings that the police are ahead. I actually like that because it basically causes them to slow down. You can literally see, even if you don't have Waze on, that there's a cop ahead. Why? Because the traffic starts slowing down as a whole. I come in the LIE all the time I live out in the Hamptons, my office in the city. And so I have the torturous 85-mile drive in. And speed limit on the LIE is 55 miles an hour. Most rush hours, it's around 5. But at other times, the average speed, clocked it yesterday coming in on a Sunday afternoon. If I was going less than 70 miles an hour, I would have been basically run off the road by the flow of traffic, 15 miles an hour over the speed limit. But interestingly enough, twice on that ride, kind of an open highway on a Sunday, started slowing down. Sure enough, look ahead, there's one of those Suffolk County or Nassau County cops sitting in the median divider. So that police presence alone showed them down. So the technology, I'm not averse to the idea of ways that there's a cop ahead because so many of these highways have a lot of cops. And it basically reminds you that there may be police out there that you might not be getting detected because of an unmarked car. A lot of the state police are now going to unmarked vehicles.
Very good. All right, folks, I know we're running a little short on time. I know that the commissioner has been gracious enough. He's going to stick around. We'll have a book signing opportunity and maybe some opportunity for some quick questions at that point. So I've got just a couple things to wrap up here. First of all, Commissioner, I can't thank you enough, sir, to say that you are a true giant. A true giant of American law enforcement. And again, thank you for your service. So
thank you as an audience. You've been very attentive, very polite. Thank you. It's nice to have such an attentive audience.
You bet. Also like to give one more shout out to Ryan and his crew. So thanks again to Cambridge Mobile Telematics for sponsoring today's luncheon. We really appreciate it. And our sponsors are great partners. Before we wrap up, make sure to check the printed program or your GHSA app on your smartphone for the location of this afternoon's workshops that will begin at 2:30. And then don't forget, we do have a reception again this afternoon that will begin at 4 o'clock. A special thanks to Lyft for sponsoring the mobile app that is helping me remember where I need to be, when I need to be there, and all that other stuff. There will be a photo opportunity with the commissioner as well outside in the, I believe out in the foyer here. And so that should take care of it. Everybody have a great rest of your conference.